When I first saw the lectionary reading for today, I had to kind of think long and hard how I can take today's reading and also incorporate what's on all of your minds, which is today's Father's Day. So hopefully you'll see a little bit of that this morning. Today's reading talks about a woman who has sinned, which we've all done. And she goes to Simon's house looking for Jesus. And as you think about that, think for a minute that this is a woman that has done something, we don't know what, but something not so great. And she's probably having all kinds of emotions about seeing Jesus. And not only does she put herself out there to go see him, but she does it in front of all the people that are in his house. It's one thing to have something that we've done that we're not so proud of, and to go to that person one-on-one to ask for forgiveness, or to show our sorrow and how sad we are. But it's another to cast that sin in front of all people around us. And I like this story for so many reasons. So many. But first, before we go there, I want to use another example of a story. And I'm not necessarily talking about this church, because I've actually worked in several churches, and I've preached in several churches, and I've been at least 3 churches. And it's not this church we're talking about. I want to make that clear. It's not this church we're talking about, because I don't talk about people as I hear, and I don't tell who those people are. But once I was in a church on an Easter morning, and you all know I'm a youth director. I work with youth day in and day out, Wednesdays, Sundays. When they text 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm there. But there was this one specific youth that I was working with who actually was in a group home. And there was another family in the church who had taken this boy on. We'll just call this boy Chris. His name is not Chris, but we'll call him Chris. And Chris had not ever been raised in the church. He had no background in the church. Not as a little boy, not as a junior high, not as a high school. And to be honest, I think he was 19 and just over the limit. And he was getting his GED. He wasn't even in a traditional high school setting. And Chris came with this particular couple, and they took him on. They brought him to church every Sunday morning. They took him out to breakfast before or lunch after. They brought him to youth group on Wednesday evenings. Some people kind of complained. Chris is kind of old to be going to youth group. He's 18 going on 19. He's not in high school. Why are you allowing him to go? Is it safe for him to be with all the other kids? Those kind of things. And you all know me well enough to know that I listen, and then I kind of do what I think is right with help from others and thoughts with others. But I decided that Chris had every right to come in, and the best place for him to start with his spiritual journey was the youth group. So we let Chris be a part of that at this church that I was at. Well, Chris came, the year went on, and Chris was actually one of my top Bible readers. And youth, you can admit, like they're looking at me, Bledsoe girls, they don't like to read the Bible. They don't. They're getting filled with it too. They don't necessarily like to read the Bible. Unless they can find a way to relate it to their own lives. And unless they can find a way that it makes sense for today. And Chris was one of those. Chris would read the Bible. He would come back and he would challenge me. He would ask me what I know about something. Sometimes I could stand up and I could say, okay, this is what I know. This is what I think. What do you think? And he would tell me. Other times he would come to me with something that I really didn't have a whole lot of information on, and I would get to stand in front of him and say, I really don't know. Let's look that up, or let's find someone that does. And so this is the kind of dialogue that went along. But on Easter morning, Chris showed up to worship, dressed to the nines. He had the suit, he had a bow tie, shiny shoes, and a hat. The hat. Some of you may know and feel that hats aren't appropriate to be worn in worship, at a time of worship. You may have been raised to believe that that's a sign of respect, and that we don't do that. Chris didn't have that experience. And Chris had a really nice hat. It wasn't a baseball hat. It was a fancy hat, kind of like what Carter and Xander wore for Easter. Really nice fancy hat. And I didn't think anything of it, except halfway through, just before church was about to start, I had a man come up to me and say, "You tell Chris he needs to remove his hat. You tell Chris that it's disrespectful to God and to this church to have that hat on. And you tell him that if he doesn't remove it, he needs to leave and he's not welcome here." I bet you can guess what I did. I kindly told this man that thank you for sharing your concerns. Thank you for sharing how you feel. And not that I'm saying it's right or wrong, but if he wants to be the one that goes to Chris, he could, but I wouldn't advise it. And I told him that Chris had never been in a church setting. He wasn't raised that that's a sign of respect. But Chris wasn't even focused on, honestly, if you would have went up to Chris and asked him to remove his hat, he would have done so. He gladly would have done so. He would have been hurt and upset to know that someone took his gesture of dressing up to the nines for God as a sign of disrespect. And I told this man that I wasn't willing to bring him down from that mountain. That it wasn't my place to play God and to say what was right and what was wrong. And so I let Chris wear his hat in church. And I'll never forget it because I sat up front that Sunday and I looked out at him and he was so proud. And he was so, first of all, he didn't have very many nice clothes to begin with. And he sang and he was happy. And he just, even after worship, he was more into Easter than even the preacher was that day. I promise you, had more energy than the preacher did. But he did everything he did that day with love and gratitude and meant no disrespect. Now I know it's hard as I stand up here, and I know some of you are thinking, and I know some of you feel that as we come into the church that we should dress in our nicest clothes and that we should show respect in those ways, and that there should be certain things we do. And I know it's really hard. But sometimes if we take that piece away of what other people are thinking, and we make it a relationship between that person and God, does it really matter what we come to church wearing? Does it really matter what we do and don't have? Is it possible that someone like Chris can be just as close and connected to God as those of us that stand today in my high heels and my skirt? And what I like about today's scripture is it reminds us that even people closest to God, Simon, Peter, John, Luke, all of those, even those closest to God, sometimes did the same thing. They would say, "But God, why would you allow her to come in here?" First of all, she wasn't invited. She just shows up on the doorstep, comes into my house, and then she takes her alabaster jar, and she doesn't even have anything in it, really. She doesn't have anything appropriate, no special towel to cleanse your feet in holiness. She's using her hair. She's using her hair. And God reminds us that that doesn't matter. That it's a symbol of the fact that this woman is professing to God and all around her that she knows that she has done something not so great. And that she knows that her life is not perfect. And all she's asking is for God to love her anyway. And God's response is, "Come just as you are. Come to me." Those that are unholy, those that have made mistakes, those that stand before you trying to do God's good work, but sometimes failing. Come to me anyway. And how can I relate this to us as a congregation? How can we turn this into a Father's Day type of a lesson? Well, another story I want to share with you. This past week we went to Let's Help, and we worked in the clothing line. And when we got there, there was someone in the back that was talking with the person we're supposed to meet with, and it seemed like they were kind of having a little disagreement. And we were just kind of standing there waiting. And I will tell you, first of all, it is hot at Let's Help right now. If you want to do anything right now, pray for them, because their air conditioner went out this last week. And they don't have, if any of you know anything about nonprofit funding, they don't have funding that fixes things like air conditioners. And when we walked in, those of you that have been in Let's Help, you know that it's glassed in. We walked in there and it was so hot in there, it took our breath away. And when we said something, and we're like, oh, well, will it be a couple days? She's like, yeah, it's going to be a couple weeks. Maybe in the next month they'll get started on the air conditioners, because there isn't any money to fix that. And so keep in mind, we were working just for, 2 hours with no air conditioning. We were on the main level. And can you imagine what it was like upstairs where they were taking classes and things? But it was warm. And so, not surprisingly, tensions kind of get with that. And there was a man. So later, the woman came out and explained, she's sorry, and she gave us a tour, and she kind of made a comment that, sorry about this little issue. It's hot, everyone's kind of warm, and this person is really passionate about what he does. And we'll call this person Abe. And Abe, interestingly enough, she said that he lived under the Kansas Bridge in a tent. And when you think about people that live under the Kansas Bridge, some of our first thoughts will be, well, the people who live under the Kansas Bridge probably live there because they can't live at the shelter, or they choose not to live in the shelter, or they choose not to do something to further their life. Let's admit, sometimes we kind of think those things. Well, Abe has been working at Let's Help for over, I can't remember, 15 years? I don't know, Tanya, do you remember what it was? 15 years. He was a Vietnam vet, and we got to learn a lot about him in that couple hours. He talked about, he actually did construction back in the 90s, and Tanya Magoo could even talk about what vehicle he did, the water truck or something, and she could probably tell you she even remembered the fact of seeing the water truck. And he was so proud of himself as he talked about the work that he did. And then he started talking about the stories, the Vietnam stories, and he talked about what it was like being a vet. He even talked about the fact that the government lost his records for quite a while, where he didn't have anything. But Abe knew Let's Help inside and out. And they said that he comes to work every morning, and he works in the clothing bank, and he helps all of us that don't know what we're doing, with patience and love and kindness, I have to say that. And then he eats lunch there, and we found out that at lunchtime, we were by ourselves in that clothing bank. Lunch is a big deal at Let's Help, especially when you don't typically get that. And he would eat his lunch there, and then after lunch, he'd work some more in the clothing bank, and he'd make himself a sandwich, and each evening, he goes back down to the river to live in his tent. And that was Abe. But Abe had a passion for what he was doing. It takes a special person to work with youth and kids and adults that really don't know what they're doing. And he really did a great job of explaining to us and showing us and just living his life with passion. And even at lunchtime, when it was time to go, literally everybody left, but Abe said, oh, okay, one more story. And he would tell us another story about Vietnam. And you know what? It was pretty interesting. We all had fun listening to him. And as I sat there, I thought about how often we stereotype that. How we're afraid to even go to some of these places because we think that they're there because of alcohol or drug abuse or any of those things. Well, the coordinator even told us that many of the people that are getting food at Let's Help right now have master's degrees. There's just not work. And I think it was the thing that, surprised me about Abe was he was just on the ball, he was clean, he was happy, but he found a purpose in life. And he lived out that purpose. Lastly, I think about my mom's own childhood, which I won't share too much about. But I will say my mom lived in a family where when she was was 2 years old, her father left. And she hasn't seen or heard from him since. And they lived in a small town of Attica, which is a teeny tiny town, smaller than Silver Lake. And that's where my grandmother, with her 3 kids, turned to. But as a young girl, my mom can actually tell you, to this day, she remembers what it's like to feel like the outcast in the town. She said that, especially back in those days, being a single mom with 3 kids, not too many people would have anything to do with her, even though it wasn't her fault. Her biological father walked out that door. She could feel the tension in church. She could feel the tension walking down the street. She said not very many people wanted anything to do with your grandmother because of those things. And it made my heart sad as I thought about that. And as I stand here today and I think about what Father's Day represents, it's a time to honor our fathers. It's a time to say thank you. But Father's Day is also a day that brings many emotions. Some of us have lost our fathers, and it makes it a difficult day. Some of us may not even know who our fathers are, and it makes it a difficult day. But Father's Day doesn't just have to be about those male figures in our lives, biological fathers. Father's Day can be those people in our lives who have made a difference. Maybe it is the single mom that's pulling 2 shifts, 24 hours being mom and dad. Maybe in my mom's case, it's the uncle and aunt who were 21 years old when my mother went and moved in with them when she was 15 and slept on their couch. 21 years old. When I was younger, my mom used to talk all the time about all the great things that my Uncle Steve and Aunt Pam had done for her. And at that time, I looked at it as like being my age, 35, 40, somewhere in there. But 21 years old, I wasn't even responsible enough to be an adult at 21 years old, though I'm sure you all are. 21 years old. It doesn't matter who we are, whether it's mom or dad or an uncle or an aunt or a congregation. We all have a responsibility to raise up our young people, from birth all the way up to adulthood. Or maybe it's we have those of us that are parents ourselves and know what it's like to be those of us that are in our 20s, 30s, or 40s with small children and know what it's like to stand here on Sunday morning when my 2-year-old goes flying out the door, screaming, and you all say, and I want to be in tears, and you all say, don't worry, it's all right, we've all been there. Maybe it's those of you that have been in that spot. But we as a congregation have a responsibility to raise up our kids too. To remind each other that we know what it's like. That we're not all perfect parents, or grandparents, or brothers, or sisters. That we may not do everything the way another person would do. But I hope you will remember your responsibility too. Not just to come to worship on Sunday morning and leave until next Sunday, but as you leave this week, find a way that you can have an impact on someone else. Maybe it's reaching out to that young couple that seems to be struggling. Maybe it's calling someone that hasn't been in worship in a while. Maybe it's helping with Vacation Bible School, teaching Sunday school, saying hello to our young people. The past several weeks, the children and youth have been meeting in the Sunday school room, and we've been having people from our congregation coming to us and telling us their stories, telling us what it was like to grow up in this church or the church that they did, fun things that they did. Kathy Kinch talked about when the old bell was here, and she would ring it, and it was kind of scary because the bell would take you up. Share those stories. Don't think that the young people aren't really listening and hearing those stories, because I can tell you now, I've heard some of those kids talk about when can we get our own bell tower. Share those stories. Be an example to those people. And remember that even when we're not so sure that we agree with something that people are doing, that it's a relationship between God and that person. And try really hard not to get in the middle of that relationship with God and that person. We don't know what people's backgrounds are like. But more than anything, if God preached anything, it was to love one another and meet them where they are. And that is so much easier to stand up here and preach than it is to live out, even in my own life. But as we leave here today, I want you to keep that vision of Chris standing in his shiny suit, bow tie, shiny shoes, and a hat on his head, but a smile bigger than the universe. And remember that God loves us just where we are.